agenda. Moved by Brian Coleman, second by Mayor Bailey. All in favor? Opposed, if any? Passed. Okay. Declaration of pecuniary interests. Is there any at this point? If not, you can advise us when it comes up. Delegations, petitions, and presentations. Is there any tonight, Heather?
No, I have none tonight.
Okay, thanks. Could we have a motion for the adoption of the minutes from the previous meeting? Okay, moved by John Pierce and second by Councillor Howes. Is there any comments or corrections? Okay, so all in favor? Any opposed? Passed. Okay. The Policy Development and Strategic Direction Committee minutes from May 11th. Do we have a motion to accept those? Accepted by Mark Leferrier.
Councillor McAlpine, those are the
And
minutes we just
second.
approved. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Business arising from the minutes. Is there any? Okay. Councillor Chambers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just wondering, at the last meeting, I suggested a couple agenda topics. I'm just wondering if staff could give some indication when we might see a discussion on drainage maintenance issues and cannabis bylaw issues.
Michael, would you like to comment on that?
Sure, Mr. Chair, thank you. So in terms of drainage issues, Mr. Waller and I talked, and he will be bringing what we would call a proactive drainage strategy to a future, probably in a 2-month time frame, I think. It's my understanding that just this week, our new drainage superintendent, our contracted drainage superintendent, is starting. So that person need a bit of time to work on that, but we're optimistic we can have that in front of you fairly quickly. In terms of cannabis, I would actually ask council what you would like to do on that. So at the last meeting during the in-camera session, you received legal advice and you did give some direction to staff on a nuisance bylaw approach to cannabis. It was going to be my suggestion that I would have Mr. Bergeron draft up a bit of a summary of the outside of the legal advice, what was determined in that in-camera meeting, and bring it to the next meeting, the July version of this committee, which would allow council to have an open session discussion on what has been discussed on that and to brainstorm further. So if council's okay with that, then I will ask Mr. Bergeron to prepare that report. He's actually got most of it done. And we'll just summarize again what we are planning on doing, and then council can add to that if they wish. So that's hopefully that meets council's approval, and we can proceed on that.
Councillor Chambers.
And that's fine. Thank you for the updates, and patience is a virtue, and we'll look forward to the upcoming discussions. I just wanted to note that with regard to cannabis, you may have seen that in our neighbor Norfolk County, there were over 100 violations of cannabis operations. That's why I think it's important that we somehow get a handle on cannabis operations in Brantford before essentially they get out of hand, like apparently they are in Norfolk and some of the other municipalities. But I will look forward to the discussion when it comes forward. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. Consent items to be approved and consent items received. Heather?
I just want to note, I believe Councillor Gatward is now on via phone. So if you take any votes or anything, if you can just ask her how she wants to vote, and if she has any comments, you can just chime in.
Okay, thank you, Heather.
Appreciate that.
Can you hear me?
Do you have any comments? Yeah, I couldn't hear you, Joan. Do you have any questions or comments for business arising
Regarding-
from the minutes?
Oh, no.
Business
Mr.
arising
Chair.
from the minutes?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Consent items to be approved, consent items received. I don't see any. So 721 RPT-21-160 development charges, amendments, updates. Robert Hewitson, do you have a report for us?
So through you, Mr. Chair, this report's just for information, and it's just on the status of the changes to the Development Charges Act and the upcoming opportunity for community benefit charges and changes with the parkland. So the report just outlines what the changes are and what our timeline is to bring the changes to council. So there will be a report coming, hopefully with our consultant Watson's in July. And then we hope to bring the final approval report to council in September. And so if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
I have one.
Do we have any questions for Robin? Joan? Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Robin, will we have an opportunity to provide information we think should be added to the development charges bylaw?
So through you, Mr. Chair, do you mean you as in council? Because we will be bringing a report in July, which would be when you have an opportunity for input.
Before the report is written.
Well,
Or
so we'll bring a
approved.
report. Watson's will come and do a presentation and we'll answer any questions. And at that time, if you have comments that you would like to see included in the study, we would take that information back. And then we would bring the final report after the public has an opportunity to weigh in if they like in September.
Thank you.
Would we have any other questions from council for if we could have a motion to receive then? Moved by Councillor Howes and second by Councillor Wheat. All in favor of receiving?
Aye.
Opposed? If any? Seeing none, it's approved. Okay, moving on to staff reports. The 8.1 RPT-21-139 Tree Conservation Bylaw. And could we have Mrs. Sheffel give us an update on that?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Michelle Schaeffel. I'm the environmental planner for the county. Also online with me this evening is Greg Bergeron from the manager of enforcement and regulatory services, should there be any questions related to bylaw related matters that he might be able to assist with. Next slide. So the purpose of tonight's presentation is to receive direction from council on adoption of a good forestry practices bylaw for natural areas, as well as deferral of an urban tree conservation bylaw. In terms of the high level staff recommendations, staff are recommending approval of the good forestry practices bylaw. The current bylaw was passed in 2007, so it's long overdue for a new and updated bylaw. The intent is to provide for greater protection for our natural areas and move towards a good forestry practices, limiting clear cutting and circumference limit harvesting. At this time, staff are recommending deferral of the urban tree conservation bylaw. One of the concerns of staff is that we just don't have the sufficient staff resources. Currently, we do not have a full-time forestry officer on staff, which means implementation and administration of the bylaw would fall to environmental planning. And at this time, the new official plan and the comprehensive review is well underway, and it is a priority for environmental planning staff. So we are recommending deferral as it is a new bylaw and it would take time to get up to speed, educate the public, and create a new system. As long as with those recommendations, there's adoption of related fees and charges bylaw to go along with the new good forestry practices bylaw. And part of the good forestry practices bylaw where trees are removed through clear cutting is that there be a requirement for replacement trees. So as part of that, council would need to establish a reserve fund for replacement tree planting fund, and then those trees would be used say by Parks and Recreation to plant trees on public lands, or maybe there'd be a tree planting program for residents. As part of the new bylaw, one of the, where clear cutting is proposed, there is a recommendation of environmental studies that they be completed to assess the impacts. And this is also a requirement of many Planning Act application, and it's quite common for most municipalities to have a terms of reference guideline that sets out the standards, such as data collection, and what really a study should have within it to determine the study complete. So it's recommended that staff be directed to develop these terms of reference guidelines, but as changes could be anticipated as a result of the new official plan, that this wait until we know what those policies will have. And lastly, with any bylaw, I think it's important to go over what's working, what's not, and so that staff be directed to report back to council in June 22 or earlier if issues do come up. Next slide, please. In terms of the background on what's happened to date, I'd just like to highlight, so we started consultation last June, about a year ago. So we heard from the community that they recognize the benefits of trees and they feel like they provide great value to the community. They also felt that the current bylaw is not providing adequate protection for trees. And a lot of the comments focused on county-led programs such as tree planting and that the county managing our own forests on our own lands. Following that consultation last December, I presented an information report to council and 2 draft bylaws were presented to initiate discussion for good forestry practices as well as on urban trees. Following that, staff have continued to have discussions about implementation of the bylaw, and I've also reached out to conduct a more detailed consultation with similar sized municipalities to find out about lessons learned, what would be the staffing requirements. So in talking to the municipalities, I found that all municipalities had a forester or arborist on staff. If not, there was one municipality that did have a consultant. And most municipalities, they had a forestry bylaw officer. So that person would administer the bylaw. They would also do forest management plans for publicly owned lands. And even with changes to the good forestry practices bylaw, where we go to good forestry practices permit, it is still recommended that at least one site visit be undertaken just to confirm that what proposed matches what's on site and the trees marked for removal. It was noted that the review time would be significantly less, so it's expected that staff time will be reduced. In terms of the fees, most municipalities, they don't charge any fees, or the fee is very low for good forestry practices. So it's not based on fee recovery for services, as once you get into a site visit, administration, you're looking at least 4 to 5 hours. Staff, as part of this, have proposed a modest fee of $100 just to cover some of the basic costs for good forestry practices. Where it's clear cutting, the fees do go up just to cover the cost of reviewing environmental studies and administering replacement trees. In terms of the replacement trees and talking to the municipalities for replacement trees in forested areas, most applicants preferred to provide cash in lieu because they wanted to use the lands for, say, farming or whatever purpose they wanted to clear cut the lands. And the benefit of that is it avoids the need for an agreement that can be complicated, securities in place, and it also ensures that the trees remain planted. Because what can happen is that applicants plant the trees to get their permit, and then a year later, they take them out. So it does provide that additional security. As part of the bylaw, I provided for both options. In terms of urban trees, the municipalities felt that education was a big component in working with the residents, and many saw the value of replanting trees when trees are removed. And in terms of the administration, generally they required about 2 hours a week to administer. It's anticipated, while it's not a lot of time, I think in the beginning it would take a lot more to get up and running, just in terms of education, training, as well as additional time for enforcement. Next slide. I just wanted to go over kind of a quick overview of the proposed change for good forestry practices, and this is for natural areas and the purpose to enhance protection. So one of the questions that has come a lot is regarding dead and diseased trees. What is the process? Do we have to go through a complicated arborist report? So it is actually regulated currently through the yard maintenance bylaw, and owners are required to keep their properties in a safe condition, free of trees that could cause property damage or damage to life. There's also a few exemptions that I have added, just provide for a reasonable cutting of trees for reasonable means, subject to being limited in area. And one is for residential outdoor amenity area, so to allow for things such as pool decks, and a permit would not be required provided that the area is limited. In addition, for a building permit, before I had that under owner's own use, but I've just separated it to highlight it. And again, so if somebody wanted to do an addition, that they wouldn't have to go through a permit process. Some additional feedback that I did receive was in regards to hedgerows and windbreaks, in terms of the benefits that they do provide in the agricultural area in terms of wind and soil erosion. They also provide wildlife habitat. So it's recommended to regulate these where they meet the definition of a woodlot or a woodland. In terms of owner's own use, originally we proposed a maximum of 20 trees in a calendar year without the need for a permit. This is fairly standard with most bylaws that I've seen, but we have increased this due to some comments that I have received. So if the property is 5 hectares or less, it would be 20 trees in a year. If the property is 5 hectares or greater, then it would be increased to 40 trees. Next slide. So in terms of the urban tree conservation bylaw, I first wanted to say the bylaw really, it's not aimed at penalizing the individual landowner and making them go through an onerous process. The intent is to address trees as part of the development process and try to have a mechanism in place. So if a developer wants to remove trees, then they would have to go through a tree conservation bylaw. And where trees are removed, that there's replacement trees. Oftentimes I find that you can work with the landowner, the design, you can redesign a site to preserve more trees. So that is the primary intent of this bylaw. And it's really very rare that an individual owner would need to remove a tree. I actually had to remove one last June, and it got me thinking, in about 20 years of owning or renting a property, it's the only time I've removed a tree. So it's really not intended to penalize the individual private property owner. So as earlier in the recommendations, at this time, staff are not recommending approval just due to the staff resources and the fact that we do not have a forester or arborist on staff. However, if council would like to consider passing the bylaw, the urban trees bylaw, staff have recommended a few changes. The first is an implementation date of September 1st. This is for a few reasons. It gets us past the migratory bird season, so people really shouldn't be removing trees at this time. And it's also anticipated that the draft official plan will be completed. So a lot of the work in terms of the official plan will hopefully be underway, and it allows the municipality time to educate the public. So we just don't pass a bylaw and then all of a sudden people could be subject to fines. So it allows for that public outreach. Another recommendation, and just considering staff resources, is that limiting it to the areas of Paris and St. George, kind of as a pilot project. The reason I didn't initially recommend this is I am concerned about, I guess, the fairness. The reality is we have development in both our urban and rural settlement areas, so I'm not too sure if it would be fair to say you can't remove a tree in Paris or St. George, but Burford is okay. So that is the primary reason I didn't come forward with that recommendation. And I've also added simplifying the reporting requirements. So if you're just removing a few trees, you're doing replacement trees, let's say the owner could do up a plan without the need to hire an arborist, and they could hopefully work with staff to come up with a reasonable solution. In terms of what's regulated, there aren't any changes proposed from December. We're continuing to recommend a permit for mature trees over 40 centimeters in DBH, or almost 16 centimeters wide. It's also one of the purposes of the bylaw is to protect the trees within the front yard and the exterior side yard, to preserve the character of tree-lined streets and just to provide shade as people are walking. And in terms of zoning, you wouldn't be able to build in those areas anyway. So the intent is to protect the medium-sized trees between 20 and 40 centimeter diameter. And except for mature trees, and I guess trees within the front or the exterior side yard, a permit is recommended where they remove more than 2 trees in a calendar year. So an owner could remove 2 trees, and it's provided an area of property, so per 0.1 hectare or 0.25 acres. So they'd be allowed limited amount of tree removal within a calendar year. So in terms of next steps, basically depending on what happens with the committee and with council, then staff would proceed to update the website, update forums, and just conduct public outreach to let people know that the bylaw is in place. Thank you.
So do we have some questions for Michelle? Councillor Laferriere.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Michelle, and thank you, Michelle and Greg, both for answering a bunch of questions this week about this. I just want to know, I guess it's like a 3-part question, but when we look at the rate of successful growth in replacement trees, so how often is the full growth of a tree successful to replace a tree taken down? And was that taken into account when looking at the formula you have for the size of the tree that's being injured or removed versus the number of trees that have to replace it? Because if it's like a 50% rate, then should we be upping the replacement level of ones that are successful? Because then we'll have less trees over time. But I don't know what the rate is. Is that a factor here?
I haven't really looked at the rate. What I did was I looked at other municipalities to kind of figure out what should we be doing, and I kind of like where the DBH, the greater the tree, the bigger the tree, the more replacement trees are required. In terms of securities, the standard is that you would collect securities for planting that tree and maintaining it for 2 years. To make sure it's maintained and watered, and you can do agreements to that in that regard.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Chambers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and through you to Michelle. There are many rural property owners, myself included, that regularly harvest their hardwood bushes. And the last thing they want is a bunch of owners that cause problems with regard to timing and various other sorts of things, particularly when the forests are managed such that they are properly managed to be regularly cut every decade or so. So with regard, first of all, to the fee, there's never been a fee that I can recall for the forestry officer to come out and inspect the trees that have been marked to be cut. So explain why a fee now is required where it never has been before. And secondly, with regard to windbreaks, nothing angers people more than if they plant a tree and then it becomes to the point of being perhaps not a tree that they want anymore for one reason or another, they can't cut it down. So if you plant a windbreak and then decide that you want to remove the windbreak, Should that not be up to the property owner? Why do we have to regulate a person's own trees with regard to windbreaks that they have planted? And I have a few other questions, but I'll stop there and you can perhaps talk about fees, talk about regulations, and talk about over-regulating rural property owners that routinely regulate or harvest their trees.
Through you, Mr. Chair, in terms of the fees, currently we do have a notice of intent, and the fee is approximately $100, just over $100. Greg can chime in. So there is a fee currently, so it's not proposed to increase in terms of that.
Yeah, that's correct. So through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct. So there is a fee for a notice of intent to cut, and I believe that's attributed to the administration and the processing for the application, the time spent for the forester to go out there, the approval letters, and the re-inspection. I think it's just cost recovery.
All right, thank you. So in terms of the windbreaks and the hedgerows, it is my opinion that they are valuable in terms of agriculture as well as the natural environment. And council could recommend if you don't support that, then that be taken out and it be an exemption to the bylaw.
Mayor Bailey, you have a comment?
Yeah, is that $100 or a little over $100? Is it the same whether the county wants the tree down or whether the resident wants the tree down? It's still $100?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, that is only for somebody who is filing an application for a notice of intent to cut, which is generally, thinning out a tree stand, basically, and it's usually considered good forestry practice. But that is the intent. But if the county is initiating it, or if we're doing it through an order under the Municipal Act, we don't charge a fee for that.
And follow up, Mr. Chair, how long have we been charging people for that?
Yeah.
Since I have been here, I can say through you, Mr. Chair, since I've been here since 2015, I could look back, but I believe this is going quite a ways back, and it may be when the bylaw was adopted. I'm not 100% certain, but I can certainly circle back on that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councillor Bell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Michelle. I learned a new acronym, DBH. Not new to me. It took me a while to find it, but now I understand what it means. My question is in relation to the comment you make about, for safety reasons, staff have included a provision that any removal be carried out under the supervision of a qualified arborist or forester. Is that something new? Is that something we have recommended in the past but now are making mandatory?
So that would be for the urban trees bylaw if it was approved. The reason being that I've relaxed the provisions for an arborist study, but in terms of safety, there could be liability issues if a person wanted to remove a tree themselves. So I really think it should be undertaken by a qualified specialist.
So to be clear, Michelle, if they cut their own tree down, would we consider that a violation of the bylaw and fine them?
It would typically be a condition of the permit.
Do we have any other questions for Michelle or for Greg? Councillor Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a few questions, if I could. Three to Michelle. Michelle, I was just looking at your presentation tonight. In the urban tree bylaw, you're still suggesting if someone were to cut down a large tree in their front yard, it exceeds the DBH, they would need a permit. Is that what you're suggesting?
That is correct. Yes.
Okay. For that permit, if I wanted to take down that major tree in my front yard, if I lived in one of the areas, would I need an arborist report?
And we provided, and I know it'll be a judgment call of staff, and it's my hope that if it's only 1 or 2 trees, that the owner could just simply do a sketch and say, here's a tree, this is a tree species, make sure it's not threatened or endangered, and propose the replacement trees. It's more when you get into kind of over 10 trees or major tree removal as a result of development that you really want to see an arborist report.
Okay, I would, being in government, this part of it, I kind of prefer tighter rules, I guess. So I'm just, I'd like to see that tightened up anyways. Question 2, I don't recall reading this, but anyways, well, you did talk about the reserve fund. That reserve fund, how do you see it being funded?
So basically, if a person wants to remove trees, say for good forestry practices and they're clear cutting, there is a requirement for replacement trees. So they would have the option to either they could plant the trees on their own property, another location approved by the council. If they don't want either of those options, they would provide cash in lieu to the county. So that would go into reserve fund, and I've had discussion with Parks and Recreation, and then they would use that fund to plant trees on county-owned lands.
Okay, that's clear then. Now, can you clear this up for me, because I was a little confused during your presentation. Is that reserve fund strictly for municipal trees being planted, or is it for the municipal trees being planted and residential trees being planted?
So it would be for municipal on county-owned lands, or I think that the county could administer, say, a tree giveaway program. I know a lot of municipalities, once or twice a year, they have a program where they give out trees to residents, kind of a promotion and encouraging that tree planting. So the point is that we would be planting new trees. It would be led by the county and ensuring that kind of a no net loss of the environmental features.
Okay, just personally, like I see the bylaw as kind of a stick approach. So I do like the carrot approach as well. Discourage, the unnecessary cutting of trees, but I guess also to encourage the planting of trees. And I know Councillor Ferry, you're asking about trees, die-offs and all that stuff. I know a lot of places they'll say for every tree cut, you have to plant 2. You probably see about a 50% mortality rate, new trees. So I think if you plant 2, you see maybe, 1.1 trees come up and all that. And I think at the end of the day, what I would like to see, I know you discussed in your report why you brought that tree conservation bylaw, because you felt trees weren't getting protected enough. I'd like to see also more tree cover for the county brand. I think we have a low tree canopy cover. So I think that's one thing, hopefully we could encourage through this bylaw. So anyways, okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Okay, Mayor Bailey, and then Mark.
Yeah, I just have a bit of a concern again. And I understand that all of the councillors, we all come from different places in the county, but I'm thinking of St. George now, and I'm thinking of a bunch of people sitting around either a campfire or whatever, having a couple of drinks, socially distanced with masks on, of course. And we start talking about this tree, and someone said, it's not going to take much to take that tree down. You know what? I got something in the car. We can tie a rope around it, and you do this, and you do that. You do this. You hold on to that, and you move the chair back, and that would make your grass grow again, because then it wouldn't be in shade all the time. And they do that, and this great big tree then comes flying down. What's the county going to do about that when the neighbor calls and says, I just heard a sonic boom, and I think there's a flying object in my backyard because I heard everything go crazy. So what are you going to do to that guy and his friends that have masks on and they're 6 feet apart?
So in terms of that, we would need to collect the information, and depending on what it was, we would need to look at the exemptions and is it covered. And for instance, the current bylaw allows if the property is less than 5 hectares, they could remove up to 20 trees in a calendar year, provided that the density of the woodland is maintained. So if you're removing 1 or 2 trees, it's likely that it's not gonna, it will fall under an exemption.
But they wouldn't have a permit at that point.
No, and where something is exempt, she wouldn't need a permit. So there is an exemption for an owner's own use, between 20 and 40 trees, depending on the size of the property.
Thank you.
Councillor Ferrier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we received a few, are they cutting that tree down without a permit calls during the beginning of COVID, I know, and it's good to have some good rules in place either way. But when you were talking about the tree giveaways or putting the replacement trees on county-owned land, but we could also, through this bylaw, the way it's written, we've had land trusts come to council. We could also partner with those land trusts to plant more trees on their properties as well. And those would remain protected because of the nature of a land trust. Would that be a possibility? Through you, Mr. Chair.
Michelle, are you able to answer that?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. I believe the bylaw is set up is so that it is county lands.
But if we were able to do giveaways, for example, then we could also, I mean, we could make an agreement, and maybe it's a separate council piece to give away trees to a land trust, or would it just be individuals?
Yeah. Okay, so I just looked up the definition. So it means the funds set aside for the purpose of planting trees in the county other than on the lot where a tree has been injured or destroyed. So I think it is a great idea, and the definition as written would provide for that.
Okay. Joan, would you have any questions today for Michelle?
Other than I am concerned about charging urban people too much at a tree. I know that trees can be dangerous if they're not cut down properly, and I just don't want us to discourage people if they have a tree that's questionable, but they don't want to get a permit because they don't want to pay $100, or they don't want to pay an arborist or whoever we need them to get through this process. And I'm concerned that could lead to trees sitting in yards that aren't safe, and big limbs come down and hurt people. So I don't know how we find a good balance to ensure that not hindering unsafe trees being cut down, but we're still protecting good trees. And I totally agree with the tree giveaway program. I think very successful in other municipalities. We have the Burford Tree Farm right here in managed by the GRCA, and great resource. I would like to see where there's no utilities, more roadside plantings. Trees, you know, in some areas of the county, residents and farmers have been proactive and planted many trees. Wonderful. And there are other areas, though, where you can drive.
Thanks, Joan.
Kilometers. So those are just my comments, and I'm glad we're not including the settlement boundaries within the current bylaw. So I guess those are my comments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Any comments back, Michelle?
Through you, Mr. Chair, in terms of the good forestry practices bylaw, we currently do have a bylaw. So trees are currently regulated. So we're just continuing to propose an update to provide for better protection and clearer policies and direction. In terms of the dead and diseased trees, they are regulated pursuant to the yard maintenance bylaw. So if they are in an unsafe condition, property owners are actually required to remove them so that they do not pose a risk. So hopefully that answers some of the comments or the concerns of Councillor Gatward.
Councillor
Yes,
Lee.
and Michelle, the diseased and injured trees you mentioned. Who's going to determine that tree should come down? Through the property bylaw you mentioned. How does that process work?
I can speak to that through you, Mr. Chair. That process basically involves the bylaw department, and we will send the forestry officer to go and have a look at the tree if it's questionable. And from that point on, if the tree is determined to be a hazard, we will issue, well, we try and work with the homeowner, but barring that, we can certainly issue an order under the yard maintenance bylaw and have the work completed.
So you would have the work completed, but what if the homeowner couldn't afford to pay for it?
It's covered through the bylaw. We would put that cost onto the taxes.
If it was strictly the homeowner's tree and not on the boulevard, then it would be county tree if it was on the boulevard. So, okay, all right, and it would go on the taxes. Thank you.
Councillor Wheat.
I'll move the recommendation as printed, seeking a seconder.
Okay, second by Councillor Leferrier. Moved by Councillor Wheat. Is there any comments on the recommendations or questions? Councillor Pierce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, just a quick comment, and there's been some good questions asked here, but I'd like to say a few things. And through Michelle's report, and she mentioned it a few times about the education to public. I want to thank them for that, because I think that is going to be the biggest hurdle here, is educating the public. So I'm very happy to hear the number of times that was reiterated, the fact that this is definitely part of this process. I also want to thank them for the fact that, as she stated, it's taken a year to create this report. I can actually say that we've been speaking of this for probably 6 or 7 years. So there's been a lot of history behind this, and I'm quite happy with the report. And thank you. It's quite a lengthy report, and I think even education for us as council reading it, but definitely the public, is absolutely crucial for this. So thank you, and I'm in favor of the report.
Okay. Any more questions or comments? Okay, seeing none, we'll call the vote. All those in, Mayor Bailey?
Voting. I'm voting.
Oh, okay. All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, it's passed. Okay, moving on to A2 RPT-21-146, new emergency management program bylaw and emergency response plan, KPOTRF. So if Katie could, or Cindy can speak to that.
Yes, good evening to members of committee and council this evening. I just have a brief summary of the report, and Kent Potruff is also with us this evening if there are any questions about the new plan. So the Emergency Management and Civic Protection Act requires municipalities to have an emergency management program and emergency response plan. In review of the emergency management program by the county's Emergency Management Program Committee, it was determined the county should update the emergency response plan as an objective to become consistent with neighboring municipalities, updates to our committee's staffing titles and organizational changes, including the hiring of the Community Emergency Management Coordinator. The emergency response plan describes the framework on how the municipality will respond to, recover from, and mitigate the impact of an emergency, and describes the legal authority's concept of operations and functional roles and responsibilities. The emergency response plan has been integral to the county's response to the current COVID-19 pandemic and is critical to our readiness to respond to a future emergency that we may face. And that is a high-level summary of the report, and we're happy to take any questions.
Okay. Do we have any questions for Cindy tonight? Councillor Bell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Cindy. No comments on the bulk of the report. I just have a comment on the Schedule D, which is the risk assessment. And it's just interesting that the thing we've been dealing with for the last 16, 17 months would only make number 6 on the list. It's just an observation. My comment, my question really is, do we consider two issues? One would be a serious road accident in the middle of town. I know we're not supposed to have heavy traffic going through the center of town in Paris, but it does happen. I could just imagine what would happen if, for example, a tractor trailer hit the speed humps without knowing they're there, as happened earlier this week, and was deflected into the buildings on the left or the right. And the second challenge I would have is the issue of train derailment. Every time I walk under the high-level bridge, I always think, well, what happens if the train falls off right now? It doesn't happen very often, but trail derailments do happen. And if you think about the trail derailment in Quebec, where the train was carrying a cargo of crude oil, which resulted effectively in the burning down of a whole town, have we considered those two issues?
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Chair, there is a hazard risk assessment that the Emergency Management Program Committee considers annually, but we do take a look at it fairly regularly whenever the committee meets. And as part of that, that list does go through possible emergency scenarios that could happen within the municipality. Both of those examples that you've identified, Councillor Bell, would be part of that. And there are secondary plans that the municipality develops in order to respond to either of those types of scenarios.
Michael, would you like to comment further?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And maybe further to what Cindy just said, in the last, I've been here for about 10 years right now, and every year we do an exercise, an emergency exercise, and our past exercises have included both a train derailment and, in fact, it was a truck accident in the downtown core that resulted in the release of a gas or something that it became a fire hazard. So we did both those exercises, I think, in the last 5 years. So it does show that we have considered these. And I think another kind of point that's worth mentioning is that it's difficult for us to anticipate every emergency, and that's why we have this emergency structure in place. So if we can't anticipate them, at least we know we can respond very quickly to them and deal with them very quickly. So I think hopefully that helps with the Councillor Bell's good question.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Cindy.
Do we have any other questions?
I have one.
Councillor Miller. I'll get to you next, John.
Two questions. 3.3 says, talks about the essential services that the county or the municipality will try to provide during an emergency. One of them is snow clearing. That clearly makes sense. And then in the Appendix A of the emergency response plan, oh no, wait, that was in there. In Schedule B, you have a list of volunteer-based organizations. There isn't any. But I was kind of curious, why do we not have, say, a list of businesses that we can rely on during an emergency? And I'll use the example of Davis Fuels. I know they've got a generator backup power, so when the hydro does go out, they can still pump gas. And apparently we relied on them in the past to provide fuel during a power outage. So any thoughts to having a list of businesses that we can rely on during an emergency? That's my first question.
Yeah,
Cindy?
through you, Mr. Chair. That's a great question. And we do look at private businesses that we may rely on, just as you've described. Staff are working on making connections with private businesses to develop memorandums of understanding with them, so that if there was an emergency and there was potentially a limit on availability, that the municipality would have a preference. Given that kind of priority, if it was required. So there are some memorandums, like I said, in agreements that staff are working on in the background to establish and have in place.
Okay, would that form part of the plan down the road, or is that just something we could? Any thoughts?
I think that it could be referenced certainly in an appendix. And there are, as I mentioned earlier, some secondary plans, like one is the flood mitigation plan that doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily spelled out in this overarching plan, but it does exist as something that's attached to the plan.
Okay. Second question, a little bit has to do with what Councillor Bell brought up, because I was thinking about the risks. You talked about the risk possibilities, risk factors, and they're listed. This probability, but a lot of times emergencies don't always happen singularly. They'll come in combinations of 1, 2, 3. Think of Fukushima. It was an earthquake with a big tidal wave and then a nuclear reactor knockout. For example, in our area, I could see this. I could see extreme cold hitting. You can deal with it if you have hydro. But if we have a hydro outage, that extreme cold, which was, a little bit bothersome to begin with, now becomes deadly. I'm just wondering, through you or maybe even through Kent, do you guys, is that something you guys look at when you're talking about emergency responses and emergency response plans, combinations of things going wrong?
Cindy?
Yep, through you, Mr. Chair. So I think, going back to what Michael said earlier, we do have an emergency exercise every year. We've looked at car accidents, trail derailments. As part of those exercises, there's usually sort of multiple situations happening that staff practice in response to. So I think, going through that, it's identified that an emergency is typically not cut and dry or clear cut. There are usually a variety of different things kind of happening. And through those exercises, we do put our minds to that.
Okay, I appreciate that. Just, I remember reading like last year, the year before, about a county in Texas where, they had the hurricane and it just stayed over land for days and it flooded everything out. And in one municipality, they had no working infrastructure, no roads, no cell phones, no gas, no hydro. So it's, I don't know, you don't ever want to see it, but I'd hate to think we didn't at least think about it ahead of time. So, okay, I appreciate the answer, Cindy. Thank you.
Councillor Gatward, do you have a question?
Yeah, and on that same segue, my question was something else, but just to follow through what Councillor Miller said, I didn't see in the plan, and maybe it's just attached somewhere, a list of evacuation centers. Do we have such a list?
Cindy?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we do have a list of evacuation centers, and they're currently part or attached to the role that social services plays in our emergency response. Through social services, we do have a plan as they would be primarily responsible to set up our evacuation centers, and the county would provide the facilities. So we do have some identified. We are working with the Red Cross right now to try to establish a new memorandum of understanding with them so that they can come out and do some assessment on some new facilities that we've built since the last time that the evacuation centers were identified. So we may be looking at expanding the current list.
Thank you. I think that there's probably a generator at every fire hall in the county, and if people were freezing or it was 45 degrees like it is in Europe or higher, we could go there and cool off or warm up. But if somebody in the city is going to have those lists through social services, yes, they will also have all the contact people and the key holders and the phone numbers to get a hold of those key holders to open up those. Correct? I know our local people probably have that information, in our offices, for instance. But if this emergency happens on a Saturday or Sunday and nobody's in the office to pass along the phone numbers or the key holder people, as long as somebody in the city has it, that's great. Do they? Do you know, Cindy?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So that plan does identify key contacts. So all that information is within that document. And I can also advise that I know they do have some new staff over at the city. And both Kent and I do have a meeting planned with them just to touch base about that particular aspect of the plan, to make sure that they're well aware of what the plan states, what the expectations are, the roles and responsibilities of both the city and the county. So I think we'll be in good shape after we have that meeting.
Good. I'm glad to hear that, Cindy. And that leads me into this on page 83 of the package, or page 8 of the report. It says under 3.5, it lists counselors' role and how will receive to ensure they understand their role and responsibilities during an emergency. When will that training be happening? You or Kent know? Soon? Into tornado season, not that Brant's going to have one, because we're going to be so prepared we won't have one.
Mr. Bradley, would you like to comment?
Or
You, Mr.
Kent know?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I didn't quite get all of Councilor Gatward's question, but I think we did training with council. I think it was in 2019. It was at the fire hall, and that was the session that council learned about the emergency management plan, about our emergency, our EOC format, and how we go about doing, responding to emergencies. So I think that was her question.
Right. It was. It says in the report, counselors will receive training, and if we did in 2019, I sure as heck wouldn't mind a refresher every couple of years, because it's not something you do once a month or once every 6 months. You get, and I guess it's harder in an emergency when phone's ringing off the hook to remember, what am I supposed to do when there's an emergency? Maybe we need a heat card to stick on our side of our fridge so it's handy, but maybe I just need to make my own from this report. But I saw that and I thought, well, I would love to have a refresher. But yes, thank you, Mr. Bradley. I remember we had that at the fire hall. Now that you say that, but exactly remember all.
Do we have any further questions for Cindy? Okay. When we have a recommendation, would somebody like to move it?
I'll move it, Mr. Chair.
I'll second
Okay.
it.
Moved by Brian Coleman, second by Joan Gatward. Do we have any comments or questions further to that? Councillor Wheat.
Approximately 50 years ago, either the late 60s or early 70s, we didn't have any of these committees or all this planning. But you know something? We had a train derailment here in Brant County, west of Paris, just south of Keg Lane. And all our emergency services handled it. And I can't recall anything going wrong. And there was no planning put into it. It happened one day and it got dealt with. Coleman will remember, right behind Johnny McCorkindale's. And we dealt with it, didn't we? With no planning. So if something happens that we didn't plan for, you can rest assured all of our emergency services will deal with it. I'm very confident in what we have here in the county of Brant.
Any more comments? No, I think it's proven this year how ready we were for this whole emergency with the pandemic and how well we've been actually been able to manage it. So I've been really impressed. So if there's any more comments or questions, then I'll call the vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Seeing none, it's passed. Okay, Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan. C. Stevenson, you're up again.
Okay, so I do have just a brief summary of the report and the plan I can provide to committee and then move to any questions. So the Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan is the culmination of work that began in 2019 through the Community Safety Wellbeing Plan Advisory Committee, with great commitment that we've had from partnering agencies since the committee was formed. The province enacted this legislation requiring municipalities to develop and adopt a plan, initially by January of this year, but the deadline was extended due to the circumstances of the pandemic, and the new deadline is July 1st of this year. The plan is intended to identify local priority risk factors and action plans that partners across different sectors can work together to make Brant a safer, more inclusive, and connected community where all residents thrive. Through extensive community engagement and analysis of the data that we collected, the advisory committee identified 5 priority risk factors for the municipality and our partners to focus on for the 5-year plan. The risk factors include, in no particular order, youth services, affordable housing, transportation and pedestrian safety, diversity and inclusion, and mental health and addictions. The plan includes action items for each priority risk factor that Brant will work with our partner agencies on implementation. We are also working with Laurier to develop an evaluation framework to measure the program success. The action plan will leverage and bring together some work that is already underway within Brant, creating greater connections and a more holistic approach to community safety and well-being. And I do have Emily O'Kell also with us this evening, who was our community safety and well-being coordinator, and has done an awful lot of work, especially recently, with pulling this plan together. So we're both happy to answer any questions that committee may have.
Do we have any questions for Cindy or for Mrs. O'Neill? Councillor Chambers.
Thanks, John. Just a question of clarification. First, I do have some other questions and some comments and maybe a suggestion or two. But if I understand it correctly, this is a county document being presented to the provincial government as a requirement of what they have legislated us to do. If I understand that right?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair, that's absolutely correct. The province enacted new legislation. I believe it went into effect January 1st of 2019 under the Police Services Act. But under the Act, the plan itself, the responsibility of the development of the plan was placed under the municipalities. And so from here, if council does adopt the plan at the meeting later this month, at that point, the county would notify the ministry that our plan has been adopted and satisfy that requirement.
Mr. Chairman, do you want to continue with my comments, or do you want to allow other people to ask questions?
You can continue, I think.
Okay, just with regard, and why I asked that question specifically was, and I should start by saying I think the plan is wonderful, and I support the initiative, and I thank the provincial government for requiring us to do this, because it's something we should have done anyway. But that having been said, since it's a county document, I'm under the impression that the mayor of the county should be front and center in terms of providing the message. And it's not being critical of the advisory committee or Councillor Laferriere, but if it's a county document going to the province, it seems that the mayor should be front and center, being the voice of the county rather than the voice of the committee. So that's one suggestion. And I would encourage the mayor to pen something in terms of a message going to the ratepayers and the citizens on its way to the provincial government. So that's one suggestion. And another comment and a criticism, if I might, and again, it's not meant to be a nasty criticism or not, but we call this a community safety and well-being plan with a focus on community. And when I read the introduction, the communities are identified: Burford, Harley, Glen Morris, Mount Pleasant, Onondaga, Middleport, Paris, St. George, Scotland, and Oakland. And that implies that, well, it says these are the communities. Well, myself, if you look at the map and make a triangle out of Harley, Burford, and Scotland, I live right in the center of that triangle. So I don't identify with any of those communities, or perhaps I can identify with all of those communities. I'm not sure how to identify. There's a number of ways to identify community without placing it on villages or towns. There's the farming community, for example. There's the, I'll just talk about the farming community. It's not listed, not a town, it's an activity, but indeed it is a community. And many of the people that live in the areas that aren't identified as the communities of Oakland, Scotland, etc. I don't live anywhere, but I live in a community. And that community and others are absent in our community wellness plan. So in my mind and my view, and you can comment on this and correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure you will, that this is an urban-based community wellness plan because the communities are identified as towns, villages, and hamlets. What about the communities outside of the towns where I live and where a lot of other people live as well? The needs may be different. They may be greater in some areas, they may be less in some areas, but there are needs specifically related to those communities. So get me around the fact that I'm viewing this as an urban-based community wellness plan, not so much a rural-based community development plan or community wellness plan. It should be both. Help me out on this. Help me explain to my counterparts in the areas that aren't in towns, the no-man lands, who have mental health issues, who have isolation issues, who have affordable housing issues, all the same things, but we don't live in towns. And we should at least change the introduction to say that the communities are Burford, Scotland, whatever, and all the areas in between. And perhaps we should identify other communities that are not population-based, maybe activity-based. I'm thinking of there's a huge religious community, the Dutch Reform church out by Norwich, which I'm closer to Norwich than I am Paris, by the way. And maybe my community is Norwich. So those just some comments. Maybe you can help me out. Maybe you can explain to me why I shouldn't be so disappointed that the rural community is not as prevalent in this as the other communities.
Cindy?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. So I think, I also grew up in the middle of nowhere with no name attached to where I grew up. I think that it's probably just the language that was used in the introduction. The intent certainly was not to exclude anyone in either our rural communities or how any person or resident within the municipality might identify with another community. Through the advisory committee, I can say that there was actually quite a bit of dialogue on how we could connect with the rural community specifically. And there is kind of a secondary study happening right now with a focus on the rural community. And we asked for participants from the rural community specifically to do a podcast, which will assist us in the implementation of this plan. So I think that, perhaps we could just take another look at the language that was used in the introduction and ensure that it's more reflective of the whole community and that there isn't this sense that the focus is only on our urban communities.
And thank you for the answer. And I think, again, awareness, and I'm sure people are aware that people do live in the middle of nowhere sometimes and are as community-based as anybody else. So I thank you for the answer. And I thank you for listening to my comments. I do have another comment, perhaps, and this is, if I might, I don't mean to, as I always say, rag the puck on this, but if I might, Mr. Chairman, a question perhaps to Michael Bradley with regard to the implementation. A plan is great, but the greatness of it is when it's implemented. And there's a circle in the report about 2021 to 2026 implementation And it's going to require resources, it's going to require money, it's going to require a lot of things to do what needs to be done if indeed we're going to do it according to our plan. So through you, Mr. Chairman, to Michael, do we have the administration and the governance and the structures in place administratively and governance-wise to implement this with what we have now? I'm visualizing that this could be if we're serious about moving forward with the implementation over 5 years, there's going to be budgetary requirements. There's going to be budgeting discussions. There's going to be prioritizing. There's going to be council oversight. There's going to be administrative oversight. And I'm just seeing that we don't have that in place now. And I'm just wondering if I'm worried about nothing again.
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you. And Cindy and I have talked about implementation. She might want to add to this answer. I think we will need some, although not a substantial amount of additional resources. We have had an employee helping us build the plan. We're probably going to consider whether we need some further full-time staff support to implement the plan. Some of the plan's implementation will be folded into our current business practices. And so that will enable us to implement it without additional cost. But I would think probably the reporting and the annual monitoring will require some additional resources, but I don't believe a substantial amount. So we are doing some in-house right now review of resources, and you're probably going to be seeing a report from me on some reorganizational and organizational changes in the next couple of months. And I would suspect this will be a part of that, probably either an evolution of an existing position or potential new position that would be bundled with some other resources as well. Cindy might want to add to that too.
And just before Cindy does, my long visioned social services, Brant County Social Services Committee, keying on the Brant County and Social Services Department, maybe this may be the fledgling of that. And now Cindy can respond.
I think Michael actually answered that very similar to how I would have answered it. We have had, the pleasure of having Emily O'Kell with us to develop and assist us with developing the plan, and some grant funding for that, which will continue for the rest of this fiscal year. But after that, to continue on with the implementation, we do need to look at continuation of resource. So Michael and I will have some more discussion around that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Mayor Bailey, did you have a question?
I have a lot of questions. I'm not happy. First of all, I'm very happy with the report. It was very well done. And the reason I'm so happy with the report is because I was at meetings and committees and ad hoc meetings and seminars and location sites and visits to places where all of this stuff was discussed and talked about. So when I read the report, I think it was very clever the way you've put it all together in a staff report, but I don't know that you should have formatted it as an annual report. I think it's very misleading. I think that calling it a safety and well-being plan for the county of Brant and then planning on shipping it beyond the borders of Brant was a slight to me. I'm offended. And then when I look at the way that it's, if you turn to the second page after you see the page from the chair, you can see that the next person on the list after the chair is not a vice chair, it's a co-chair. So if I've never learned anything from the city of Brantford, when you have co-chairs, it means that there's two of you. Kevin tells me that every time we meet. So why weren't the co-chairs on the front page instead of a chair? I'm offended by that. I'm offended by the format. It looks like It's very deceiving. It doesn't look like the county of Brant has instigated this life. We developed this whole county council, have sat on all these committees to come up with all these numbers, all these facts, all these statistics, and they have rounded it up into a wonderful little package. And for that, I'm very grateful. But we're the ones that put in the time, and we're the ones that created this wonderful place to live, work, and play. We have changed the temperature of the county of Brant, this council. If anyone's picture should be on the front of this report, and it shouldn't be formatted as a annual report, it is a report from staff, not from one counselor, but it is a report from the entire county, because we allowed all of those things to go as far as they did to become statistics and numbers to be compiled into this report. So if you're going to take something beyond this county, first of all, we have to remember that there's only one of us on this call that was elected as the mayor, and I represent the county from beyond these walls. And I feel like I've been slammed and overlooked, and I'm quite offended. I'm quite offended because everyone knows what I have brought to this term with the partnership and the approval of all of you, not two of you or three of you. All of you had to prop me up to have things work the way they've worked. And although the report is great, you know how we pick a chair. We say, who wants to be chair? And someone's hand goes up. So, you know, it's not a sacred place to be the chair of any committee. It's the first hand in the air usually, followed by other people that are interested in the subject matter. So I'm very, very offended that something so good could be used, I feel, politically against this council. That's it. Thank you.
Cindy, would you like to respond to that, or?
Through you, Mr. Chair. You know, certainly Mayor Bailey, the intent was not to, from staff's perspective, overlook anyone. And, you know, what you said, I think also aligns with Councillor Chambers' suggestion to ensure that we do have yourself as representative of the council as well as part of the messaging at the beginning of the plan. So we can certainly make that change to the document before it's finalized.
Councillor Wheat, would you like to comment?
When I got my package on the weekend, I was looking at this. The question, it's going to be a tough one for you to answer, Mr. Chair, John. So you may not even want to answer. But to me, there's two things in here. First of all, there's a report from Stevenson, Ellens, a couple others, Jake, and Emily. So am I voting on that recommendation, or am I voting on the next 75 pages from a committee? Those next pages, they didn't even need to be in the report as far as I'm concerned, because I'm prepared to vote on what Stevenson and Ellens and Curson and O'Keel have brought forward. And I agree with what Councillor Chambers said. If he wants to make a motion, that it's the mayor that should have been attached to this, but I don't think it needed to be attached at all. This is, to me, it's grandstanding. And all that we needed was the first 3 pages, the report from Stevenson, Ellens, Curson, and O'Keel. That's all we needed. We wasted a whole bunch. For me, most of you probably got it on a computer, but I got another 75 pages of waste of paper. Because the key stuff is in the first 3 pages. And that's what I want to vote on, not the next 75 pages. I'm done.
Joan, you have some questions, then I'll go on to Mark.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I have. I read the plan. Yeah, there was a lot of information before we actually got to the plan, but I thought it was interesting information, and thought it was well put together. I'd like to thank the committee that worked on this, and I think they did a good job. But I agree about, the mayor and council can send this report off to the ministry. You did get, I believe, the grant through the services and the ministry that is in charge of requesting this plan. And a couple of questions on page 4. No. Sorry. Lost it now. There were 2 strategic committees mentioned in here that were joint committees, and one was to do with the drug strategy, and another one was to do with Brantford Brant youth. I certainly have heard of the Brantford Brant drug strategy. However, I'm not sure if council has ever had a report on that. I don't recall one. Perhaps we have. But the youth strategy that's mentioned in here, have we seen either of those? Do you know, Mr. Chair, or perhaps Mayor or the committee chair, the Ferrier may know if we've seen those plans, or did they come through the social services and it just hasn't been presented to our council?
Cindy, would you be able to answer that? And then I'll go to maybe Mark about that.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, I believe those plans would have been presented through either the social services or the Brant County Health Unit Board, but not directly to the County of Brant Council. Certainly, if another member of council knows otherwise, feel free to suggest something otherwise, but I don't believe they've come directly to the County of Brant Council.
And
Councilor LaFerrier, would you like?
Oh, if I could follow up, Mr. Chair, I think that's really important that, drugs are in the news every day, it seems. We have our police services in both communities who are fighting with this problem every day. And the fact that cannabis has been legalized hasn't really helped anything. It's created more problems for municipalities than anything. And I'm not sure what's in that drug strategy, but I would certainly like to see it, especially when, it's talked about in our plan. And the same with the youth strategy that's mentioned. I think that's so important. I can recall when I sat on the Police Services Board and there was complaints about youth hanging out in downtown Paris, skateboarding on whatever they could find, and causing vandalism. And we created the after-school youth program at the Sillaps Community Center, which was very well attended and helped keep those youth busy doing something else rather than hanging around on the streets. And I was so happy when that program was a success. And the OPP had recommended that we needed that in the work that they had done. So they are a good resource, and I hope their attendance was good on this committee that did the report, because they have a wealth of data that they could and probably did share with. There was no mention in here about the situation table that is currently created that deals with our mental health issues. And when I looked at the number of calls that's their highest call volume is mental health calls. So I really am glad that is going to be looked at. I know, Cindy, you mentioned it when you listed the 5 items, but yet in the contents, the 5-year plan contents don't mention the mental health calls or mental health issues that we were going to. I read this whole thing and it took me a long time, but I think it's a good plan, and I just would like to see more information because we're promoting those 2 strategies. Thank you.
Cindy?
Yeah, just a couple of comments, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Gatward's comments. The Brantford Brant Community Drug Strategy and the Together for Youth Strategy, I just had a quick look at the back page of the draft plan, and there are links to both of those plans at the back of the document. Certainly, if anyone's looking for a hard copy, we'd be happy to provide that to any member of council. And just Councillor Gatward's comment about the mental health and addictions being missing from the contents. I think she's referring to the table of contents and actually caught the same, I guess, omission today when I was looking at the plan again. So we are making that adjustment to the table of contents to ensure that that is included.
Great, thank you very much. And I don't know if, when the ministry looks at this plan, would it be better to put the plan up front and all the background information behind the plan? Or is this the way the template is designed?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the ministry, what they're looking for from the municipality is that the municipality has approved and adopted the plan. We will send them a copy of the plan, but they don't actually have to approve it at their end. They're just looking for us to adopt it locally. I understand that they may be looking at some additional legislation around plan implementation, but that is just under discussion right now and something that we're monitoring. So,
thank you.
Councillor LaFerriere.
Thank you, Councillor Chair McAlpine. So just to address a couple of things here. One, Councillor Gatward brought up the term template. These do follow a template, and every single one of them, and I've read over 20 of them now, have a template where there's a message from the chair. None of them have a message from a mayor. I could care less whose message it is. I was asked by staff to write a message. I wrote a message. Often the message from the chair isn't even a member of council. It's, you know, somebody from police or somebody from a community agency, or it's often a councillor, because often councillors end up getting picked as chairs for these things. The concern that it's political, doesn't hold any water. I'm not running again. I'm announcing that here. I decided April 6th that I wasn't running. People can ask Councillor House. Him and I have talked about this. This is before this community safety and wellbeing plan was in this draft that it's in now. I'm also not running for other office. So that that concern, just I understand the concern, but it's not a valid concern as to why. Again, I was asked by staff to write an intro, as every single one of these has an intro from the chair. 2 of them have intros from co-chairs, but the co-chair in this case was a vice chair in all actual being, and that's fine, and I'd be fine with that too. I could care, like I said, I could care less. One of the things about the piece about the deliverables, I think that's really valid. Something staff and the committee decided to do is not disband the committee. Unlike, say, the Brantford Brant housing strategy, the 10-year housing strategy, which I sat on as a private citizen in the county many years ago, that got disbanded when the report was done. This isn't being disbanded because we could come back at any time and do that piece to offer more suggestions, to look at the accountability of the plan as a community. We can add more community agencies, because I think this document will actually go to agencies who will be more excited about this plan. And I do want to comment on that. For 13 years, I've been a social worker in the county of Brant, and the city of Brantford specifically. And I said this at the last meeting we had with the community safety and wellbeing plan. And I want to say it to this committee as well, and to members of council. At that time, 10, 13 years ago, even 5 years ago, community agencies had lots of connections in Brantford and felt less connection to staff and council in the county of Brant. That's not a bad thing. That's just how it was. There was, most of these organizations are located in Brantford because it's central. And the things that are talked about in this document are things that in the social service agencies, in the community agencies, have been talked about for a long time. And I know, and I just want to send this message from members of the committee who all work for agencies, that they were so excited about this report because it says the things that the agencies and the frontline workers have been saying for 10, 13, 20 years, before my time, after my time. And to have that reflected by the county, to have that reflected by a county body, to have that go to the province, to have data that we can all use on issues that are really important. Just a small example, we have the police constantly saying that domestic violence is such a huge issue in this community, but we never hear it talked about. All we hear about is traffic and traffic and traffic, and we want the police on the traffic. But in this document, it shows 85% of people in the county of Brant think domestic violence is a major issue in this community. And that's good to know, but you know what? People aren't talking about it because it's such a sensitive topic, right? The way they talk about traffic. Traffic's easy to just blame on the other guy. Domestic violence is a lot more complex. So it's really nice to see that stuff reflected. It was done with big thanks to the different universities that worked on this. But yeah, everything's it's templated. It's very standard. You can read about 20 of these that are floating around online that have been approved, and they all have this format. So we can change things. I'm open to that. I know the committee would be too, which is why we'd asked for input from council this week too. But we do have a tight deadline, and the concern I have is that if this goes longer, if we miss our deadline, we might have to repay funding the province gave us for staff and other things. So whatever we do, we got to do it quick. We can call back the committee if need be at a moment's notice. But yeah, so again, the concerns about politics and optics, I understand them, but I don't agree with them. I know they're not founded in reality because I know what's in my heart, and I know I just did what staff asked me to do. So I just want to, a lot was brought up. Thank you for your time, and I hope people look at the merits of the report. And you take my picture out of it. I didn't even submit it to be in. But it's a good report, and I think it can be used by many agencies and many governments at all levels in a positive way.
Okay, Councillor Mayor Barely.
Yeah. So first of all, I would like to thank everyone for working on it's a great report. I would like to move the report, and I would also like to take the first 3 pages away, and we will wordsmith with the county, with staff, the proper wording to represent council and the mayor, bringing this new plan forward as something we believe in and that we're going to make sure happens. The political piece, Mark, I'm sorry that you're a little bit offended, but this was the first week that you were using your LinkedIn on all your messaging, which takes you directly to your own personal stuff. And that's what brought that on. It was nothing to do with you. But anyway, that it just isn't right. It was always to be brought forward as a staff report, and I thank staff for that. It was never to be an annual report or formatted as such. So thank you for the report. I make a motion that we receive the report with the modifications to the first 3 pages. Seeking a second.
Second it.
Somebody, okay, so we have it on the table. Is there any questions or comments further? Councillor Bell.
Thank you. I was beginning to worry that my picture was not showing up on your screen. My hand's been up and down enough times. I just want to say, I think the temperature around this discussion just rose far too quickly. I think this is a very well prepared report. It is a draft report at this point. It is being brought to this committee. It will be brought to council for them to support with changes if necessary. And we have the opportunity to make the changes that are being proposed. I think all the recommendations that I've seen in the report are just good common sense recommendations that we can all recognize. And just to take up Mark's point, I was surprised by a couple of things, and one of them was around the issue of abuse. Mark said that 85% of people think abuse is a major problem. That's perhaps a bit of a stretch. It's a small problem or something bigger, but it's far away from what I expected to see. And that's the biggest surprise, I think, coming out of this report. I do think that the database or the survey results look a little bit skewed, and I don't know whether they've been modified to reflect the population distribution we have. We don't have 75% females in the county. I don't think we have 68% of people who have college and university degrees. So somehow or other we may have a set of data which is distributed incorrectly, and I don't know what the team did to make appropriate modifications for that. Some of the big findings I thought were around transportation and affordable housing, and they play right back in to the discussion we're going to have on Thursday, which is our official plan. So this plan, it has linkages to other things that we're doing, and I think we should see the opportunity to carry forward recommendations from this safety and well-being plan and make sure they're reflected in our official plan as well. But again, I just want to reiterate, I don't think anybody should feel personally offended. I'm sure that was never the intention. And I think the mayor and staff can write that front bit to be as appropriate as they feel it should be. But I do think we should bring the temperature down on this. I think it's a great report. Well done, staff. Let's carry it out.
Yeah, I agree. Cindy, do you have some comments? And I'm not sure if Emily would like to comment about the stats, but Cindy?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, Emily and I did have a brief discussion about the stats today, and maybe I'll call upon her to address Councillor Bell's comments about that.
Hi there. Thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair, just to address the statistic comments, they were actually weighted by Dr. James Popham at Laurier and his team. So it was taken into consideration the fact that it was predominantly responded to by middle-aged white females. So they were weighted, the results were, to ensure that it wasn't all skewed to one side. We do have the document that shows the various kind of breakdowns of that through gender, race, income equality, or sorry, income standing and all things like that. And then those were factored in. Unfortunately, I'm not too much of a statistician on my own accord, but Dr. James Popham and his team at Laurier, as well as in partnership with the University of Saskatchewan, were able to weight that data accordingly so that it wasn't skewed one way or another, at least to the best of their abilities, given the fact that it was largely responded to by white females.
Well, thank you for that. And I think it would be worth adding a comment to that effect in the report, that it has been moderated to reflect that change. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I have a question before we vote.
I'm going to let Steve House comment next, and then I'll come to you, Joan.
Thank you.
Councillor House.
Oh, thanks, Mr. Chair. Through you, I was hoping to make this point earlier, but I wanted to just respectfully counter Councillor Wheat's position on the inclusion of the plan. I appreciated having the opportunity to read the entire plan, and it seems to me most appropriate that at a policy development and strategic direction committee meeting that we have the entire plan to review in detail. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who had participation in putting all that together, and I'm glad it was included. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate that, and I agree with you fully. And that's the whole purpose of this committee, so I understand it. So, Councillor Gatward, your comments, and then I'll go to Mayor Bailey.
Or it's a question, Mr. Chairman. It's a question about the motion was that we amend the first 3 pages and then receive the report and the plan, and then for it to council for approval. Is that what? Am I correct? The reason I'm
I believe
asking
that's.
is. Sorry?
I believe you're correct.
Okay. So the reason I'm asking is Councillor Chambers' comment about the various communities. When I read that, I thought, okay, they left out Oak Hill, they left out Canesville, they left out Langford, they left out various small communities in rural areas. Fairfield has their own sign. That's where Councillor Chambers is, in the middle of the Burford Triangle. All these little communities, like in Ward 5, there's 9 alone. So I can understand that the committee just picked out the main, maybe the main communities. I'm not sure how they chose the ones they did, but maybe so we don't offend anybody in any community, we should just list them all. That's just my suggestion if we're going to amend the introduction there on page 5. And that might just solve everything. So that's all. And I wanted to thank Cindy for pointing out. I guess I read the whole plan, but when I got to the back page, I thought, oh, resources and documents, and I didn't actually notice that the drug strategy and the youth strategy are there. So thank you for pointing that out. And I'm
Councillor
finished.
Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Going back to what and Councillor Goward just brought it up, and what Councillor Chambers has said earlier about the communities in the county of Brant, he's absolutely correct, and so is Councillor Goward. I would just rather much say from the citizens of the county of Brant, and then everybody's included, because you're never going to name all the communities in this county. So I'd rather see it come just from the citizens of the county of Brant. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Pierce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, I've been sitting here just listening to the conversation that's gone on here. And I think we need to circle ourselves back to the report itself. As we say, the report itself, which is the meat of the report, is fantastic. It's something that we've needed for a long time. It's something that is definitely going to help the entire community of the county of Brant. So I would agree that when it goes back to staff to to take a look at those first few pages, then it actually does just state that, because it's from all the citizens and it's for all the citizens in the county of Brant. So I think that being the disclaimer across the top, and really that's all it needs to say. Put the county of Brant logo on there, put that on there, and give us the report. That's what's important here, not what's in front of it.
I think that's becoming the consensus here. Mayor Bailey, you had a comment?
I'm fine. I'm fine. I was only going to say we shouldn't try to name all the little pit stops in the county of Brant.
Okay. Councillor Chambers.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I support the recommendation as it's printed on the agenda with the moderations that we've discussed. But I have an amendment to the recommendation as well, if I might place it before the committee seeking a seconder. And that amendment is this. And further, that a more detailed implementation plan be presented by staff to the committee for further review and consultation. And why I'm requesting that is the plan's great and it's a wonderful plan, but that's all it is at this point, is a plan. The implementation is what's important. If we're going to follow through on the plan, we have to move forward. This is a dramatic shift, in my opinion, in what the municipality is doing. Social development is something that's never been done before to any great extent. This plan shifts that onus and to a further social development agenda for the municipality. That's huge. That's like, we can all remember when all we talked about was infrastructure and official plans, but this is social development, a movement towards that. And I know Councillor LaFerriere, tremendous of experience in this, and I commend him for chairing this and moving these items for discussion. But implementation is important. That's why I'm proposing that we don't want to just adopt the plan. If we're serious about it, we need to take it to the next step, and that's to talk about implementing it. And that's what I'm requesting through my proposed amendment, seeking a seconder.
Councillor Wheat, you seconding that?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So talking to the amendment, Councillor LaFerriere? No,
yeah.
John, I'll get you next.
I guess just discussion on that. The only concern I have is that it can't come back to this committee unless we have a special meeting of this committee and get to the province by July 1st, which is the deadline. I don't think anybody wants us to have to repay funding to the province if they decide as such. But so could that amendment be worded as to council? Because we will have a council meeting, but I don't know if that's enough time for staff to create an implementation plan. Alternatively, could it be that we get an implementation plan after it's been approved by the province? Would that make more sense, I guess, to staff?
Yeah, that I think is my intent. My intent is not to hold up the plan moving forward. Part of the meat of the resolution that's not being amended is to accept and adopt the plan. So that's going to be first and foremost. But if we adopt it hand in hand, it is the commitment that we move forward, and that's what the amendment is about. So it's not to have an implementation plan before we adopt it. It's to adopt it, be serious about it, and then start to implement it since we've adopted it, is how I'm thinking about that, Mark.
So through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Chambers, would the amendment be to have an implementation plan created after provincial approval of the plan? Okay,
yeah,
that makes total sense, and I'd be fully supportive. And doesn't put staff in a bind of 2 weeks to put together a wholesome implementation.
Councillor Pierce.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. That's kind of where I was going with that. I was just curious if Councillor Chambers was looking at formulating this implementation plan, which I agree, the plan is nothing without the implementation plan itself. But absolutely, with the deadline we have, it needs to be done afterwards, and that appears to be the case. So I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah, yes, Mr.
And
Chairman,
Mr. Chair?
to Councillor Pierce, the Maple Leafs had a plan to win the Stanley Cup, but it didn't happen. And if we have a plan, I want to make sure this happens. So let's commit ourselves, if we're serious about it, to adopt the plan to implement the plan.
Mr.
And Mr.
Chair, I
Chairman,
was
if
with Councillor
I-
Chambers.
Just a
If I
second, Joan.
might, maybe we should just
Okay.
say that an implementation plan be presented to council in November. Like, it doesn't have to be done tomorrow because staff are really busy with reopening and the pandemic still. And I think this implementation plan is going to take some doing. So I think the fall would be a better time to expect something to come back, my opinion.
There's no time commitment on the amendment. It can come back next year at this time, but just don't lose sight of the fact that if you plan something and adopt a plan, you have to implement it.
Mhm. Do you have some comments, Cindy, on that?
Sure, yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. Staff have been talking about, in fact, earlier today, about meeting to develop the implementation plan and action tables. And we are targeting to have that put together by the fall. We're looking at September or October. And I think that way, if there are some priorities that we want to tackle in 2022 and need some resources through the budget in order to do so, that we could come to council and let you know what we might need into next year in order to implement the plan.
So do we have any other comments or questions with the amendment? So, okay, so Mayor.
I see it as a friendly amendment.
Okay. So we'll add that as a friendly amendment then. And that's okay with you, Councillor Coleman, seconder? Okay, so then if it's okay, then we will vote on the amendment or the original as amended. Motion by David Bailey, second by Councillor Coleman. And all in favor? Okay. Anybody opposed? I didn't hear from you, Joan.
Sorry, I had to mute my phone because my dog started barking. I voted in favor.
Okay, thank you. That's unanimous. Thanks very much. Okay, we did have a communications from Jason Birch, and I don't think that we handled that, but I believe that we can accept that and send it for review with the final report for the tree.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair,
conservation bylaw.
we have to deal with 8.3.1 yet.
Oh, okay.
I'll move.
So
to
okay, and seconded by for receiving the minutes. Second by John Pierce, Councillor Pierce. All in favor of receiving? Okay, motion, all opposed? Passed. Okay, the communications, if we receive that and refer it to the review final report, is that the appropriate way to handle that? Maybe Heather can handle that.
Councillor McAlpine, I know that staff has looked at the requested changes and are supportive. So if committee was willing to make a recommendation that those be adopted into the revised tree bylaw, then we could just prepare the bylaw accordingly for presentation to council next week or 2 weeks.
Okay. So we have somebody to Move that motion.
I'll
Moved by
move it, Mr.
Councillor
Chair.
Coleman and second by Mayor Bailey. All in favor? Any opposed?
Mr. Chair,
Yes?
I'm not sure I received a copy of whatever it is, the comments from this person that is changing the tree bylaw.
It was in the addendum this afternoon. It was from the organization in regards to trees removal with gasoline pipelines and such.
Okay, I don't think I got that, but that makes sense.
Okay.
Maybe I'll just abstain from voting because I haven't seen it. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Appreciate that. So that was passed. Number 10, Chief Administration Officer update. Michael, would you like to report?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening again. I have a few items that I'll discuss, and one was asked earlier, which I can update on as well. So I'll start, as I usually do, with our ongoing operation or our ongoing emergency response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Our EOC met again this morning. We meet each Tuesday, usually in the mornings. It was our 107th business cycle meeting. So we're continuing to work through the pandemic. I think, as you're aware, there is a new 3-step recovery roadmap that the province has laid out in terms of how we're going to reopen from the third wave of COVID-19. We have been using over the last several months a decision matrix of decisions that we made that help us keep track of which decisions we've made and when we need to reverse or amend those decisions based on the changing situation. So we've now moved our decision matrix to be aligned with that 3-step recovery. So we will be reopening certain services according to the 3-step recovery. And as we did before, we will reopen services. Staff at the EOC level will make decisions to reopen services if we can do so safely and in keeping with the current budget. If reopening will result in higher costs than we have budgeted, we will seek council's approval on that. So you may see some reports. We're still working through that, and some of the second and third step regulations are still a bit unclear. So you'll be receiving a report later this, probably before the summer break, from Mr. Walton and I on our current tendering status of capital projects, and noting that there are still a number of supply chain issues impacting the system. We're receiving guidelines from industry organizations, construction associations, and such to that pretty much on a daily basis. So you'll see something from us on that in the near future as we get our heads around it. So, I was asked to speak about the OPP service enhancements, which we've discussed a little bit. I can note that Acting Inspector Nash and I met last week. We had an excellent conversation. So as you'll recall, we have budgeted now for 2 traffic constables as enhancements to our current OPP contract. Inspector Nash has posted the first of those positions. It is posted. It may be closed at this point, and he anticipates filling that position at latest by early July, the 1st of July. So he'll post the second officer in early September. He wants to do that so he doesn't have any gapping issues or overlap issues with staffing, because staff would be moving from one position to another. But he does have a strategy that I've been working with him to address the summertime and early September. He'll be redeploying a school resource officer to the traffic division over the course of the summer. So we'll have that additional officer. And he and I have also worked out as well that we will augment that with paid duty officers, because we do have budgeted funds for these enhanced officers. So they'll secure paid duty officers as they're available over the course of a week for traffic deployment as well. So we think we're going to see those at least the impacts of 2 additional traffic officers in the community starting in early July. And I think that's good news for all of us. And I'm really happy with Inspector Nash's approach to this and working well with Robin and I on these matters. Another question that had come up, and it was asked at the beginning of the meeting, was automated speed enforcement. Robin did provide a report a couple months ago that laid out what her approach is, and we got delegated authority to enter into the number of agreements. The most significantly complex agreement is the contract with Redflex, who will be providing, operating, and maintaining the cameras themselves. As per Robin's report in July, or a couple months ago, her target to complete that was July, and her and Jody are working on that diligently. It is a big agreement. It's an agreement that was developed by the City of Toronto. They were the ones that issued the RFP that other municipalities could get in on, and I do understand it is very complex. So they're also, in that timeline, they'll also complete the agreement with the Joint Processing Center, which will process the tickets. And both of those are on schedule for completion in July. And with those two contracts in place, Redflex has a 90-day lead time, as Robin mentioned in her last report, to deploy the cameras. So we're still on schedule for that. So that would bring us cameras in the early fall. If that goes better, then we might see them earlier. But I think in the meantime, we'll work on all the other operational aspects, signage. We'll be reviewing the community safety zones throughout the community, and all the other things that we need to do to get this in place. So it's a big learning curve for us, but I think it's well underway. And the last thing I'll just touch on, I updated committee at the last meeting on gypsy moth control, and just noting that our gypsy moth treatment program did complete last week. So we've completed treatment of all the county lands that were contemplated in our approach. And I believe at this point, all of the private land treatment that was going on in the community has also been completed. So the low flying planes that we saw for a couple of weeks should be gone. So the treatment window for gypsy moth using the biological product is small, and it opens very quickly each day, opens and closes very quickly on a day-to-day basis. So we will start to see results from those treatments, and we'll be doing some surveys, woodlot surveys, as well as some surveys of a select group of private landowners throughout the community to determine how the population is going. And I hope in July I'll be able to provide you with a summary report on what we've went through with the gypsy moth program. And hopefully by then we have a sense of whether the population is going to persist or collapse, because we may need to consider this approach next year as well. So, Mr. Chair, that's my update this evening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Do we have any questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Michael, for your report. It's much appreciated. Under other business, we have a motion, notice of motion from Councillor Coleman, rural internet. Would you like to speak to that, Brian?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be very brief due to the time of the evening because the ball game has started in Chicago. So there's been a number of concerns by residents and whatnot about internet service in the county and whatnot, and I'm not talking about any companies and whatnot. And I know that we have the SWIFT program working and whatnot, but internet has become an essential service for a lot of homeowners with kids home from school and trying to learn and everything like that, and the businesses that are trying to take place. So with staff's up, I'm hoping to bring giving notice of motion to bring a motion forward at the next committee meeting of this to about rural internet service. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. And I don't think I have to do anything with that at this stage. So I don't believe we have any in camera. So we're just asking people to stay on for a few minutes after the meeting so we could do some tests. We have a motion for adjournment, I guess, if there's nothing further forward in the council.
Move to adjourn.
Moved by Councillor House.